Hello, this is the third episode of my tournament hero guide. Today let's talk about Xalia. She's the ultimate hero when it comes to control. One of the most common drafting mistakes I see from new players is neglecting control. I lost count of how many times I win by simply playing a tavern wench and watching my opponent end their turns without being able to do anything because they have literally no control cards on a hero without built-in control capability. If there's one thing I can promise you about playing Xalia, it would be that you will never find yourself checkmated by a simple wench. Another reason I think she's a good choice for new players is her ability lets you entirely ignore one aspect of the game, wars, which makes it easier to play with her compared to other heroes. So what is her ability? The first part of her ability is you gain one skull per turn. Pretty simple and a direct copy paste of Sofocatro's ability, but Sofo doesn't really exist, so that doesn't count. The second part of her ability is what makes her unique among all heroes. When your hero attacks, either by spending skull or magic, or by playing cards that attack and count as hero's attack, more on those later, your attacks will go through walls. Her ability gives you no econ though, so don't forget that when drafting with her. A common mistake I see when drafting Xalia is neglecting the econ aspect of the game in favor of more control or skill and magic gain, which obviously synergizes with her ability, but is all meaningless if you can't buy the cards you need. Let's talk about Lackey. It's a decent choice if you're playing an ally build with some protection, otherwise skip it. It also copies the second part of her ability, which leads to some interesting interactions that may catch you off guard the first time you come across them. The first is in fighting. When you're playing Xalia and your opponent plays this card, your hero will attack one of your allies, ignoring any walls you have. This also applies to Lackey, so keep this in mind when you see infighting in your opponent's bank. Just because you have walls doesn't mean one of your 1 HP allies won't die. The second interaction is with Stampede. It should be obvious enough when you use it as Xalia, but some of you might not know that when you use Stampede while having Luckies on your side of the board, they will also attack through walls. It's not useful in practice, but hey, the more you know. Good cards on Xalia are resource generators. For the synergy with her second ability, it's up to you to decide whether you want allies or non-allies, but both are equally viable. Bit sticks, while not great, are still acceptable in case you don't have anything better, or if they somehow have some synergy with other cards in your deck. They are also quite useful against your worst opponent, Alin. The reason is, as I said before, Xalia already has econ problems, so when you kill Alin's allies by spending skull or magic, it gets even worse. Be aware though that Hedge Guardian is a great counter to Beat Sticks. Here are some cards that count as hero attacks. Non-persistent cards always count as hero attacks, and persistent cards don't, except when explicitly stated otherwise. These cards aren't great on Xalia by any means, but I'm listing them here for the sake of documentation. That's it for card discussion on Xalia. There aren't any special synergy cards worth mentioning. You might be wondering, but what about Assassin? It belongs to the Beatsticks group, so it's not so great. Let's move on to some decks that you could build on Xalia. The first and the most recommended is a generic deck. It's simply more consistent to go with this usual strategy and takes advantage of Xalia's control capability as a tool for game management. Here is an example of an H-New generic deck I had on Xalia. The next kind of build is a Song of Spring combo. The best card to combine with Song on Xalia is Coup de Grace. It's very easy to get lethal with this combo as long as you have an early Song restock. If you don't have Coup though, these cards are also good options. While not as potent as Coup, they are still decent enough as a combo with Song. If you do have coup, persistent and useful cards such as these will be great additions to your deck. Here is an 8 new deck that I had on Xalia using the Song Coup combo. The last one is a Burn Rush deck. The strategy here is to use cards that don't scale well into late game, but are cheap and good enough in the early game to hopefully kill your opponent before the lack of scaling from these cards become a factor. I don't recommend this strategy because it can get quite inconsistent, but among all the heroes, it works best on Xalia due to her ability to ignore walls, so at least it's worth mentioning as a viable strategy on her. The best burn card is Hemlock. While much more expensive than Belladonna, it does more damage and can win you games faster, which is the main point of this strategy. The next card is Reconnaissance. Similarly to Hemlock, it's more expensive than its counterpart Surveillance, but it's much faster. And for this strategy, fast is more important than cheap, as long as it's not overly expensive. The next card is Behold the Veil. This card is basically a better Belladonna for burning purpose. It's cheaper, it's more versatile, and it lasts indefinitely. Moreover, since most cards in this strategy are reusable, holding two or even more veils at the same time not only doesn't clog your hand in the traditional sense, but also is an advisable play most of the time. These cards are also good additions to the deck if you do have them. This is the only deck where Enchanted Treaty isn't recommended because, unlike most other decks, the healing matters here. If you don't have any better cards in the pack, though, you can still pick it and play it, but just make sure that you don't recharge it. Next, I will show you one of my recent drafts with Xalia. In this first pack, we have Brigand and Barbs to consider, but for me, Barbs is just a worse Beholder Veil on Xalia, so I go with Brigand. Next, we have Heart of Aurochs and Masquerade Ball, but Aurochs is quite expensive, and sometimes it gives me food, which means I will have to draft some food sink for it to be really useful for me. Ball, on the other hand, is also quite expensive, but at least I know I will always get two useful resources when I play it, so that's what I go with. Here we don't really have any good choices, but Smitten is at least cheap enough and it could be some useful econ support. Next we have three good cards to consider. The first the first is Treaty, but since I'm already playing Xalia and I have Masquerade Ball, I probably don't need extra control. I would rather have something that could either help me scale better or synergizes better with my draft. Marshall is also a good option because it synergizes with Brigand and Xalia, but it's quite expensive and it needs protection, which I don't have at the moment. So I go with Misdirect because at least it can protect my Brigand, and the fact that it is destroyed after use is not that big of a problem since Brigand also has a chance to destroy itself. Here, I'm seeing the potential for a burn strategy to work in Reconnaissance, so I go with it. Next, we have Scroll of Petals, which is also a good option for a burn strategy, but I prefer to redraw my ball as often as possible, which Petals prevents, so I would not take it. Coordinate also has some synergy here in Misdirect and Reconnaissance, but Reconnaissance is the only useful thing that could be enhanced by Coordinate, so I don't go with it. Instead, I go with Informant, not because of the effect, but more because of the restock. Because sometimes Informant could give me another Reconnaissance, for example, which I could use for my burn strategy. Here we have a good, not good, but an okay card for burn strategy, which is Belladonna, so I go with it. Okay, here we have Behold the Veil, which is one of the best cards for this burn strategy. Yeah, I don't have any great options for a burn strategy. Waylay is okay, but it's pretty weak and, and slow as well because it only attacks 3 times. I already have Belladonna, which is already quite slow, so by going with Waylay, I might have some problem with ending the games fast. Ballista may be useful, but it's a bit stick, and I just don't like bit sticks on Xalia. So I go with Deceit, which gives me some extra econ to buy Masquerade Ball and Reconnaissance. Finally, we don't have any good options for a burn strategy here, but at least Ballista would be somewhat useful if it could do some damage early on. And that's the end of my draft. It's not an ideal draft for a burn strategy, but since I never had a successful 8-0 run with a burn deck on Xalia before, I decided to give it a go for the sake of this video guide. Even though I got an 8-0 with this deck, I still don't recommend going with this kind of strategy when playing Xalia, at least not initially, because there were so many games in this run that I only barely won with a bit of luck. It does really have some consistency issues. My final verdict on Xalia is she's a good hero, while not necessarily easy to draft because of the lack of econ. She's definitely pretty easy to play, and for that reason, I recommend her for new players. Thank you for listening. The next video will be on Annie, the coin hero. See you next time, and remember, don't spam wars against Xalia.